Hi, my name is Robert. Please read the comments in the About section of this video. It has valuable information and updates. My YouTube channel has a disclaimer video that I encourage you to watch. And please like, share, and subscribe. I hope you found what you're looking for. Thank you very much for watching. In this video, I want to talk to you about tuning up the turbo system in your car. If you have a car that has a turbocharger, which a lot of cars are nowadays, the newer ones, I think the turbocharger system should get somewhat of an overhaul or a tune-up after it's 10 years old, and then tune it up every 5 years after that. That should be plenty. Now, a tune-up doesn't mean you have to replace parts, but it does mean you should check these parts out. Let's get started. The first thing I think you should do is find out a little bit information about your car, specifically how much turbo boost it's supposed to have. Now, if you have a turbo boost gauge like this that doesn't read actual PSI numbers or inches of mercury vacuum, you may want to either permanently or temporarily install a good quality turbo boost gauge, so you'll know if the system is performing as it's supposed to, or if the system needs attention because it's underperforming. In general, a car that has a turbocharger will produce anywhere from 20 to 60% more power than an engine of its same size that does not have a turbocharger. An example: if you have a 2.0 liter engine that does not have a turbocharger, it may produce 140 horsepower. If you have the same size engine, 2.0 liters, that has a turbocharger, it may produce close to 200 horsepower. So the turbocharged system is designed to help the engine produce a lot more power, even though the engine doesn't have a larger displacement. As with anything man-made, over time it begins to deteriorate, parts begin to fail, and it needs tuned up or quote-unquote parts replaced so that it can perform close to what it was when it was new. Now, on these turbocharged cars, I'm sure that most manufacturers design their cars going out the door to produce somewhere around 60 or 70% of their capacity. They don't want to max out its capacity and have it wear out prematurely. So it's producing 60 or 70% of its capacity so that it has longevity. Most car manufacturers would like to see the engines and components in their car to last 2, 3, 400,000 miles. So they're not going to stress it out to the max going out the gate. Therefore, you should have parts that should last 20,000 miles easy. So 10, 15 years down the road, it may be time to look at some of this equipment. If you have a turbocharged car, turbo systems is designed to run on boost when you're accelerating. When you're cruising or sitting at idle, it has a vacuum system on it, just like a non-turbo car would. The reason I recommend that you install a turbo boost gauge that actually displays the pressure is so that you can know if your car is performing properly. So, an example, this car here, this high pressure turbo Volvo 850 in 1996 was designed to produce 9.5 pounds of boost when it's at its maximum. So when you get your foot to the floor, you're passing a car on the motorway, or you're accelerating hard to get onto the freeway and merge smoothly, this car should be producing 9.5 psi. The turbo boost gauge that's in the dash right now, it doesn't actually tell you what the pressure is. It has that white area that indicates it's in boost. It has the black area that indicates that it's in vacuum, but it doesn't actually tell if it's 9 pounds or 6 pounds or 5 pounds. So if you install a boost gauge, whether permanently or temporarily, you'll know if it's producing its proper boost pressure. Now there's a video linked in the comments to show you how to install a boost gauge. Nonetheless, here's a vacuum tree here that makes it easy to install a boost gauge. You take one of these extra ports, hook it up there, or there's other places where you can tee into the boost or vacuum system that'll give you good readings to your gauge. At any rate, install one of those gauges, take the car for a test drive to find out if it's producing the proper boost. The turbo system has several components, and what you want to do in making sure that this stuff is performing efficiently or trying to determine if something needs to be replaced, you want to do a functional test, which is a test drive, and then you want to do a visual inspection to see if anything visually needs to be replaced. The system is not that complicated. However, there is a few things that will help you understand how a turbo system works. There's a video linked in the comments to show you that. But I'm going to briefly go over that stuff and help you know how to tune up your turbocharged system. A lot of people let this stuff decay over the years, and then the stuff is not efficient, and then they get to the worst case scenario, which is replacing the turbo, instead of dealing with the minor stuff, which is bringing that stuff back up to stage 0. Your turbocharged system is designed to take exhaust air that's coming off the engine through your exhaust manifold out to your tailpipe and run that stuff through a turbocharger unit, and it has a turbine which the exhaust gases will run across and make that spin. There's a shaft going through the turbocharger unit onto the inlet side of the turbo where this air is feeding down to the turbo, and that side has what we call a compressor wheel. That compressor wheel turns, it sends compressed air up through this tube here, which is called a charge pipe. That, in most newer cars newer than 2000, will send that into what's called a intercooler. So the intercooler takes air off the turbo, which may be a little warm, sends it through this intercooler, which is on the front of the radiator, take that air, cool it down, send it out of the charge pipe, and sends it into the intake manifold, sending pressurized air into the combustion chamber of the engine. Now, basically how a turbocharger works and most combustion engine works is the following. Now, you know you have a combustion engine car if you have to stop at a gas station and put gas in it. Gas mixes with air, it gets ignited by a spark, and that produces a tiny explosion in a cylinder, and that cylinder pushes a rod down and turns a crank. That produces your power. So the more air you could get into that combustion chamber mixed with the proper amount of fuel will help that engine produce more power. That's why a car with a turbocharger can produce more power than a car without a turbocharger. A car that does not have a turbocharger, this engine is working primarily off of vacuum and altitude pressure to produce its power so that the engine can work and function and produce whatever power it can. A engine that has a turbocharger on there is using that turbocharger to pressurize the intake system and force more air into the combustion chambers, mixed with the proper amount of gas will produce more power. So what you want to do in tuning up this system is just simply make sure that all of the components are working properly and that they're not degrading and ready to fail you. All right, let's get started. Step number 1, find out what maximum boost pressure your car is supposed to be able to produce with the turbo system. This car, it's 9.5 psi. So let's go with that. Number 2, install a boost gauge that will actually read that number off to you. In this case, at least 9.5 psi. Connect that to your system so that it gives you a reading. Link in the comments. Number 3, take the car for a test drive and see if it's producing that kind of pressure. If it is, fine. All you want to do now is a visual inspection and replace anything that looks like it's deteriorated, because you don't want it to fail. That's basically it. So let's come out to the engine and take a look at these turbocharged components. On this vehicle, the turbocharger has a heat shield over it, but here you can see what we call a wastegate actuator. You can see the compressor housing. That's where the compressor wheel is housed. You can see part of the wastegate actuator under that heat shield. Now, that turbocharger has vacuum or pressure lines that come off of it and help the turbocharger function properly. It has a wastegate actuator that controls the position of the wastegate to allow the computer to control how fast this turbo spins, to dictate the pressure that goes into the intake system to make sure it gets the air that it needs to function properly. Basically, here's your components of the turbocharged system. Number 1, you have the turbocharger unit. That consists of the compressor housing, the CHRA, which is the heart of the turbocharger, the exhaust flange, which houses the wastegate, and then it has a wastegate actuator bolted onto that. Then it has a turbo control valve that monitors and controls the turbo pressure in here by functioning the wastegate actuator. Then you have vacuum lines that go to that turbo control valve or boost control solenoid, same thing. Then you have your charge piping that the air that the turbocharger produces comes off of. When that turbocharger starts pressurizing the air, it comes through these what we call charge pipings. Then it goes into a intercooler. That intercooler is designed to cool the air that comes off of the turbo. Now remember, the turbocharger gets its power coming off of the exhaust gases. Exhaust gases are pretty hot. That turbocharger heats up. Because of that heat, some of that heat may be transferring into the turbocharger on the compressor housing side, and it may heat up the air because it's running off of exhaust gases. Let's say today that it's 50 degrees outside. Well, those exhaust gases may be 900 degrees. They may be transferring heat over to this compressor wheel side of 150 degrees. So air coming out of the charge pipe may be 150 degrees. Hot air doesn't burn as well as cold air. Cold air will produce more power in the combustion chamber. So they want to take this air that's 150 degrees, run it through this piping, and run it through a intercooler. Now this intercooler has air running across it because you're driving down the road, air's coming through here, you got a fan on here. You may have a wind chill factor of air coming through this intercooler. On a 50-degree day, this wind chill may be 35 degrees. So it takes this air that was 150 degrees, it tries to cool it down to 35 degrees, it pushes it out of this charge pipe and into the intake manifold, out of this charge pipe, into the throttle body, into the intake manifold, and into the combustion chamber to ignite and produce the power. So you have your charge piping, your intercooler, more intake piping, your intake manifold, and then into the engine combustion chamber. Now what you want to do is make sure that all of this stuff functions properly. If you've taken the car on the road test and the turbocharger produces the pressure that it was designed to, we're going to assume that the turbocharger is still okay. The turbocharger has a moving part in there. It has a shaft, it has a turbine, it has a compressor wheel. That stuff turns, and over time, as those parts wear, it won't be able to turn as fast as it was brand new. So let's go back to something I said earlier. Let's say the system is designed to work at 60 or 70% of its capacity. So if you have a turbocharger that had 100% capacity at new, and now it's worn down to 80% of its capacity, it's still going to produce the power that the car was designed to receive, because the car was only requesting 60 to 75% capacity. Therefore, as long as that turbo is able to spin fast enough to produce 75% of this initial capacity, you're still going to get the boost pressure you need. There you have it. The car is still producing the boost it needs. Let's say the turbocharger, even though it's wearing a little over the years, it's still in good enough condition to use. No need to worry about that. Now, another thing that we can assume, since the car is producing the boost pressure that it was designed to produce, the charge piping and the intercooler is still in good shape. What I mean by good shape, I mean it's still able to hold the 9.5 psi pressure that it was designed to hold. It doesn't have any holes in it. But what you want to do is come and take a look at it and see if it may be wearing to the point that it may fail soon. So this pipe is metal. That's never going to wear. But down here where it joins on top of the turbo, there's a rubber coupling. You want to try to take a good close look at this rubber coupling to make sure that it's not getting soft, starting to crack, or getting to the point that it wants to tear and need replacement. Because you don't want to be driving down the street and then it fails and now the car's not running right. Now, one thing I'll say about this is, because this is a sealed system, all of these hoses and pipes are sealed. If something comes along and puts a hole in any of these rubber connections or these rubber hoses, that will function just like if you or I had someone stab us in the lung. The car will not be able to breathe properly and it will likely suffocate. If a car suffocates, it's probably going to stall and not run, may not even get you home. So you want to check these rubber lines, these rubber connections, these rubber hoses to make sure that they still seem like they're in good shape. They're not cracked, they're not about to tear, they're not about to fail you. Now, here on this charge hose, if you look at it closely, it has 3 or 4 different layers. You can assume that one layer can be bad, another layer could be good, and you still do okay. However, if one layer is bad, it's going to be stressing the other layers more. It might be time to replace those. The best way to check all of these rubber hoses is actually to take them off. Now, you could do a quick check on them. A quick check would be to squeeze them to see if they still feel firm or see if they feel soft and mushy. If they're soft and mushy to touch, replace them. If they still feel firm and hard from one joint to the other, they may be okay to leave. It is very common for this hose to collapse when it starts to get soft, and the hose that goes down to your throttle body intake to tear and get a hole in it. You might be able to put your hand under here. If you pull your battery, you can put your hand under here, feel this hose, make sure it's still firm, it doesn't have any soft gooey parts on there. Feel this one, make sure it's not soft and gooey. Feel and squeeze this one, make sure it's not soft, gooey, have any areas that could feel like it's getting flat. There's one down here where it goes into the intercooler. You want to feel it, make sure it's nice, firm. Heck, this is the hardest one of them all. And just make sure that these hoses are not deteriorating. If those are good, you've done that part. Last but not least, you want to check the vacuum lines that come off of the turbo, come off the boost control solenoid or turbo control valve, and go to your boost gauge or other vacuum things that come off of your intake manifold or throttle body to make sure that all of those vacuum lines and pressure tubes are in serviceable condition. Now, if you have a Volvo 850, your boost control valve is screwed into the side of your airbox. If you have an Esser's V70, it's hooked on the back of the airbox. At any rate, you can unplug the plug, take these two T25s out, and have full access to your vacuum lines that come off that boost control valve to inspect them for damage or age or cracking. So here I've taken the boost control solenoid loose from the airbox, unplugged it from the wire connection, and now I have easy access to the vacuum lines on this boost control valve. If you look at these lines and you can bend them and you see any cracking, they need to be replaced. It looks like somebody has replaced this one with some inferior vacuum hose. You don't want this stuff to be able to collapse or balloon when it's expanded. So you want good quality vacuum lines on here. Somebody, in my opinion, has replaced this with low quality lines. Another thing you need to know, since this system can take as much as 9 psi, you want to make sure that these lines are clamped onto the connector. Let me disconnect one so you can see it. From the factory, this had metal clamps on there. I normally zip tie them or put some kind of metal clamps back on them. But as you can see, this one was not clamped on, neither are the other two. But there is a little ridge on this valve to help prevent the hose from slipping off. I believe the proper size for these hoses going to this turbo control valve are 4 millimeter. Most of the vacuum stuff going up here to the vacuum tree is 3 millimeter. So if you're going to buy some high quality replacement hoses, you want to get probably 4 feet of 4 millimeter, and then maybe get 4 feet of 3 millimeter and replace these hoses and tubing, especially if you see cracking. Now, as you see, that one just pulled off the Wastegate actuator. If you see that there's low quality hoses on there, stuff that you can easily pinch close, you may want to go ahead and replace that as part of your tune-up for your turbo system. If you see cracking, you want to get high quality hoses. You don't want any kind of hose that you could bend like this and it kink. You see how that hose kinked? I got 1 inch of hose on each side and it kinked. You don't want hose that can kink. You want hose that will maintain its shape and keep its proper opening so that the system can monitor what it needs to. Now, some people think that all of these valves that look like this are the same. Turbo control valves are used in your turbo system, but there are some purge valves and stuff that look like turbo control valves. However, they are not. A turbo control valve will normally have color-coded markings on there. You have a red mark on there, a blue mark on there, and a yellow mark on there. I often see these lines hooked up improper on the turbo system, which will not let the turbo system work properly. The red line goes directly to the turbo housing, the compressor side of the turbocharger. If you follow this turbo inlet tube down, just under the inlet on this turbo, there's a nipple, like this vacuum nipple here. That nipple is supposed to be fed to this red line. That reads direct boost coming off of that turbocharger going into the charge pipe. It gives this information right to this boost control valve or turbo control valve on some of your newer cars, and that sends a signal and lets the computer know what boost that turbo is producing at any given millisecond. The next line which is blue, goes from the boost control valve or turbo control valve to your intake pipe. This one's broke. There's a nipple on there that this one plugs into. That lets the computer know, because it gets a signal in this valve, sends it to the computer. That lets the computer know how much air is being sucked, like the vacuum pressure being sucked into the turbo. So you got one that's telling you the pressure that's coming off the turbo. You got another one that's giving you the vacuum that's being sucked down to the turbo. The third one, this yellow line, goes to your wastegate actuator, and it helps the computer and this valve operate the wastegate actuator. If the computer indicates that too much pressure is going off the turbo into the engine, it can damage the engine if too much pressure goes in at one time. It will read that excessive pressure. It can see how much air is being pulled into it. It will then activate pressure on this hose, which activates that wastegate actuator. It will open up the wastegate on the hot side of the turbo and let air bypass the turbo so that the turbo slows down. The faster the turbo spins, the more pressure comes through this charge pipe and into the engine. The slower that turbo spins, the less pressure that comes into this charge pipe and into the engine. People need to know that the turbo is always spinning. Depending on how fast it spins tells you how much pressure will go into the engine through this charge pipe. What you want to do is make sure that you have good quality tubing hooked up to your turbo control valve. On this car and many others, the turbo boost line that comes off of the red nipple is teed into and fed to your boost gauge. So if you don't have a vacuum tree or some kind of other line coming off of your intake manifold, you can tee off of this red line and run that to your boost gauge. That will give you direct boost pressure that's coming through this pipe and into your engine. Good place to hook up a boost gauge. Now over here, you have a vacuum tree that is feeding different components that need vacuum and or boost pressure, like your turbo boost gauge, off of this tree here. Now you got a thing up here the idle control valve hooks into. On this car, the vacuum system actually functions the cruise control. So there's a line that goes here to your cruise control vacuum pump. There's a line that goes here that goes to your boost gauge. There's a line that goes here that goes to your fuel pressure regulator. So this is a source of vacuum or boost that is in your intake manifold. Again, your boost gauge reads boost and vacuum. This is tapped in after the throttle body. So it's more realistic to what the intake manifold holds. You see down here, you got a dump valve that comes off the turbo. It has a hose going over here into the intake manifold. Now, how that works is it bleeds boost pressure off of the turbo when you take your foot off the gas. Say, for instance, you're climbing a hill or passing another vehicle. You pick up speed, you go by them, now you want to slow down. When you let your foot off the gas, your throttle body closes, but that turbo is still spinning to produce power to get past that car. When that throttle body closes and that turbo spinning, it's going to be building more pressure in this charge piping and in that turbo than it needs to. So there's a little bypass valve right on the back side of the turbo, right here where the charge neck comes out of, and that line takes that pressure and dumps it back into the intake manifold behind that throttle body. So that air is circulated into the engine, not just dumped off into the atmosphere. Some people put a blow-off valve on their charge piping A blow-off valve is a little more efficient at doing that. However, this has a bypass valve with a vacuum hose. If you look here, all of this hose is deteriorated, about to come apart. So this is a hose that you want to replace because it's soft, mushy. Look at that. I pinched it closed, it won't even open back up. So that comes off of your bypass solenoid or bypass valve on the back of your turbo, goes to your intake manifold. This is the kind of tubing you want to get off of your turbocharger and replace. So you got some very cheap, inexpensive stuff here that bends and collapses. You got some stuff here that's deteriorated. You want to replace that vacuum stuff off of your turbo system. Basically, we've covered what you need to do to tune up your turbo system in the event that your turbo system is working properly. Now, what happens if your turbo system is not working properly? It's not giving you the boost that it's supposed to. The S70s and 850 low pressure turbo cars is supposed to produce about 6 psi. These high pressure T5 cars are supposed to produce 9.5, almost 10 psi. If that system is not working properly and not giving you the boost, you need to find out what is damaged or worn out beyond its serviceability that you need to change to get that boost pressure back. One point of failure could be that your boost control valve or your turbo control valve is failed. It's no longer allowing the car to boost. When that's the case, you normally get very low pressure, 2 or 3 psi, and you normally will get an error code that's telling you your turbo control valve has failed. The second common thing that goes wrong is some of your turbocharged piping is worn or torn or has a small hole in it. A hole as small as this vacuum line hole right there can bleed off 3 or 4 psi. So if you got a torn vacuum line or a loose vacuum line because it's popping off, you want to replace that, seal that back up, take it for another road test. Another thing that I have seen, people drive over things, and this part right here is the bottom part of your intercooler. I have seen people hang those up on parking bump stops and crack or tear those open. If you crack or tear those open, the car probably won't produce any boost at all, and it'll probably be suffocating. That is a common thing. It's supposed to have this little weep hole there. I don't recommend plugging those. If plugging that will make a difference in your boost pressure, you got another problem. Your car should be able to boost past that little weep hole. That weep hole is designed to allow this system to discharge moisture from it, let it blow out of there. When I've had a bad turbo in the past, the turbo was leaking internally, it would drip oil out of that hole when I would park. I'd park the car, I'd come back 5 minutes later, there'd be a 4-inch oil spot on the ground under that weep hole. So that can be an indication that you got a bad turbo. Last but not least, if your turbo system is not producing the pressure that it should produce, there's a chance that your turbocharger is worn. One of the first indications that your turbocharger is worn is that it will not spin fast enough to produce the required boost pressure that the car was designed to produce. I had one car, it was supposed to get 10 psi, it was only getting 7, and that slowly dropped. 1 month it was getting 9, the next month, 5,000 miles later, it was only getting 8, a month later it was only getting 7. That turbocharger was wearing out. One way to determine it is to pull your intake piping, check the compressor wheel to see if you could wiggle it, see if it has play in it. If you have play in your turbo on your compressor wheel, there's another video linked in the comments. That shaft is wearing out, those seals are wearing out, those bearings are wearing out inside the turbo, and it's not tight enough to allow that turbo to build the pressure that it should. So it's slowing down how fast the turbo can spin. If you have a turbo that's worn out and slowing down, you have a decision to make. There's basically 3 decisions you can make. 1, you can get the turbo rebuilt to new stock performance. Send it to a turbo rebuilder, redo it yourself, have it balanced, reinstall it in the car, you should be good to go. Second option for a turbo is to replace it with a new one of the same size and production make. That will just simply allow you to replace the turbo and go on about your way. Number 3, you can replace that turbo with either one rebuilt to newer specifications, which I'll call a hybrid turbo, or B, replace it with a bigger turbo that would require you to have the car reprogrammed or retuned to deal with a higher capacity turbo. So there's your options in doing a turbo service, if that is indeed a point in your system that's worn out. So there you have it. My recommendations is do your first turbo system tune-up or inspection at 100,000 miles, and then every 50,000 miles after that, redo a tune-up system for your turbocharged system. If you find that you got to replace some worn-out parts, go ahead and replace them. Your car will perform and run great. One of my cars currently has 475,000 miles on it. I've seen a lot of these original turbos last as long as 300,000 miles. So having a turbocharged car and engine is not something to be afraid of. It just needs you to make sure the system functions properly so that you can get the benefit and the economic advantages of having a turbo system on your car. Thanks for watching. If you feel that this information was useful, please like it and share it with your social media friends. You can subscribe to my channel so that you will get notifications of future videos that I post. You can follow me on Twitter, and if you need to contact me directly, please visit my website. And if you have any questions, leave them below, and someone or myself will reply to them. Again, thank you very much for watching.